All right. Hi, everyone. Thanks for staying till the end of the show. Appreciate that. So the Northridge earthquake was a housing disaster. We had a housing crisis before that.
Will you introduce yourself? Sorry.
That's sorry. Yeah, I just jump into it. That's what I do. So I'm Sally Richmond. I'm actually an LA native. Grew up in the San Fernando Valley. My dad was an engineer. My brother was a child actor. My parents got divorced. So I'm very Southern California. Went to UCLA for my master's in urban planning, late 70s, yes. Santa Cruz, undergrad, 70s, yes. So I've been working in the affordable housing field since the late 1970s at the City of Los Angeles Housing Department since 1993. And so I had just been there a year when Northridge hit. And our department, so I've been working in the policy arena. I was not a finance officer, but I worked on a lot of program and policy development. And so one of the first things I did that second year was to respond to this earthquake that happened at 4:30 in the morning. We had a very entrepreneurial general manager, Gary Squire, who unfortunately died of cancer several years ago. But I do give him credit for going above and beyond, not following the rules. I had a very high-level city employee lobbyist in Washington, D.C. who called up. I was the highest level staff person there and said, "You can't tell the federal government what to do." And I just thought, well, you're not here and you don't know what it's like with the chimney, the bricks and the streets and everything else. So yeah, we had a housing crisis start in the late 1970s here in Los Angeles. That's when rent control was enacted here and in Santa Monica and other places. When the speculation in the housing market, and for whatever reason, everything got very expensive. It wasn't like that. So we were dealing with that housing crisis. We're established in 1990, but then Northridge gave us all of a sudden hundreds of thousands of damaged units. And as you can see on this, this is damage. It was primarily a multifamily disaster. Now about the same number, 1,500 single-family buildings were vacated, red-tagged, unsafe to enter. 1,200 multifamily buildings, which were both apartments and condominiums. But those multifamily buildings held almost 18,000 units. LA is a city of renters. 60% of our population live, maybe not in multi-story, but in rental housing. So we, for many years since the shakeout scenario came out, thought that is too low an estimate for how many people are going to be displaced. And so that's the kind of thing we need you to help us estimate with the multi-stories and how the vulnerability of buildings. I know you mentioned that before. So we were only 3 or 4 years old. We had to figure out, what do we do with a disaster? We've never had this before. So I was in the policy unit. A colleague looked at Mary Camario's research on the recovery of housing after Loma Prieta in 1989. Far fewer housing units damaged, but almost nothing had been done a few years later. So we knew this was not going to be an easy thing. And then we talked to colleagues from LA who had moved to Florida and gone through Hurricane Andrew and said, well, what was the federal response like? Did people get help? What happened to people who were homeless before? Well, basically they stayed homeless. They didn't get housing. We also learned that at that time in the early 90s, we had a recession. The end of the Cold War actually caused a dip in our aerospace and military industries here in Southern California. A lot of middle-class jobs were lost. Housing and other properties lost value. So a lot of apartment owners and single-family owners, their houses were underwater. They owed more on their mortgages than the houses were valued or the properties were valued. They were not going to be able to get a Small Business Administration disaster loan because they just weren't qualified. So we knew there was going to need alternative financing to help rebuild. There were about 300,000 housing units that were damaged, but some of them were just cracks, not serious. So what did we do? We consulted housing experts. We had friends in the Clinton administration who would work for Mayor Bradley and then move to DC. We contacted them, and that was after those kind of contacts. And my colleague, who was a master's student at CSUN, he was doing the infancy of GIS in 1994. He made a big map with all the building and safety data points of the damage. We overnighted it to Senator Feinstein in Washington. She had it on the floor of the Senate saying, this is why they need so much money. It's not just in Northridge. So we used the technology that we had. And ultimately, because of all those contacts, we got over $340 million from HUD, Housing and Urban Development. And that was critical to lend out to people who couldn't qualify. We coordinated with FEMA and SBA. They had to give us their letters, and they even gave us lists of people who were rejected by them so that we could reach out to them and say, we have another funding source for you. We work with lenders, home savings, and others to develop tax-exempt bonds to finance. And we also had to think about renters who had been displaced. They needed to know that they could return to their buildings when they were fixed and that they weren't going to have to pay higher rents. So what are the changes since then? Well, in the Northridge, we hired a whole bunch of people, a lot of finance officers. We created loan programs. We pushed out that $300+ million, but we didn't do housing inspection. Building and safety did all of the code enforcement in the city. In '98, after grassroots and Blue Ribbon Committee pushing the city to proactively address the increase of slum housing, that partly started with Northridge and the recession and just continued. So we now routinely inspect all rental housing in the city of Los Angeles. Actually, we got a Harvard Innovations in Government Award for that program in 2005. I wrote that application. So we, from the beginning, always gather the inspection data electronically and we store it. So we have information about all the rental properties, not condominiums, but all the rental properties in the city of LA. And we actually provided the initial list to the city's building and safety department of what might possibly be the soft stories that then would be subject to the ordinance that was passed. And then in 2004, we increased an emphasis on preparing ourselves to respond, because the public has an expectation that government is fully prepared to do whatever it is needed to respond in disasters. And, you know, that's a little bit optimistic. And in the emergency management field, they talk about managing expectations. And that's why we talk about you need to have not 3 days worth, you need to have 2 weeks or a month's worth of medication, et cetera, et cetera. But we said we need to be prepared internally to respond to a Northridge or worse event. And a lot of that institutional memory had been lost. So what that led to, and I was one of the people working on that, I got very passionate about it. So luckily, working with the Emergency Management Department, Rob's department had some of these federal funds, Regional Catastrophic Preparedness Grant Program, RCPGP, which we use to capture institutional memory, to focus on the whole region, not just LA City, but the 5 counties, San Bernardino, Riverside, Orange, us, Ventura, to bring folks together who had gone through Northridge and other disasters. How did you manage the housing? Focus specifically on housing recovery, because we know from our experience in Northridge, this is a multi-year. The first responders come in, they're out, and then everybody's left on their own to solve their own problems. And particularly in a catastrophic event, we can't do that anymore, and we're seeing that with the wildfires. So that also, we also use those funds to develop a desktop and mobile application using the ATC 45 and 20 forms, which are the disaster or damage assessment forms, or safety assessment they call them, so that we can go out in the field and gather that data. We developed that before FEMA developed Rover. Everybody's developing an app. We have something that we've tested in exercises. We're trying to convince other city departments to use it. We develop an iPad version because we figure mutual aid folks, that's the most likely thing they're going to have, and we have our own tablets. So those are some of the things that have changed since Northridge. Also, you know, as others have said, Dr. Lucy Jones came to the city. I've had interactions with her, and she got everybody's attention and really pushed us way down the road in terms of what we've done, and I'm very proud of that. We have a mandatory seismic retrofit program now. Marissa and I and others are working, trying to figure out how are the owners of smaller properties in lower income neighborhoods with low income tenants who cannot afford the pass-through costs, how are they going to do this work? And so we're trying to figure that out. What I appreciate about resiliency, as opposed to calling it emergency response or preparedness, is that it includes the everyday conditions that we and our constituents face. My department exists because there are poor people in LA. Our funding is federal. We run the rent stabilization ordinance. If there were no poor people in LA, or anybody that had, if nobody had housing problems, our department wouldn't have existed. So I think we have a kind of moral imperative to make sure that those folks are protected. And so when you think about a disaster, so a single family homeowner, okay, you have to move out of the house, but maybe you can park a trailer in your driveway. That's not the case for somebody in a 20-unit or 100-unit apartment building where there's no open space. Where are they going to go? So we're trying to think about those things, and we actually need your help. What we've learned from lots of disasters, it's better to know each other and what we do and what our capabilities are and what we can contribute before the disaster. And so what I would urge you is to figure out how you can help us. And here's some concrete things you can help us with, besides the amazing work you're already doing. Debris removal. Debris removal is a major problem with disasters. I don't know how Japan moved their debris so quickly. I don't know where it went, maybe in the ocean. But until the debris is removed from the roads, you can't get through those streets to help people. Until the debris is moved from the property, you can't start rebuilding the house or demolishing what's left. Debris has typically been treated as a private property problem. It's on your property, you deal with it. That's why after Northridge, those of you who were here saw all the bricks from people's chimneys on the street, because the city or whatever, for liability reasons, could not come on people's property, but they would pick it up if it was in the street. Of course, it was in the street for a year or more. It was there for a very long time. So if you multiply that and you look at the wildfires that are happening, they're developing solutions and innovating, unfortunately, in Northern California because of these fires. They're coming up with debris and toxic removal solutions. We need more of that. No sites want to accept that debris. You can't rebuild until you have some place to put it. So that's a societal issue, but I think it's also a technological issue. How do you recycle some of the materials that can be recycled? Another issue that we have is once you remove the debris, how do we quickly put in temporary housing, whether it's FEMA trailers or modular housing or something. There are lots of different issues with the plumbing, with the electrical, with the elevation. I mean, all these construction issues, not only construction issues. How is government move quicker to do the things that take a long time in what we call peacetime, not after a disaster? We did a project with the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers where we took some sites that were open. They went and they did schematics and figured out how we could place those. It was never completed because they were not able to get complete information from all the city departments that were needed. I don't mean to badmouth my city here, but that's just the reality, is that until there's fire under all of us, we're just not going to get it done. And so anything any solutions that you can help us figure out, I think there are solutions that have been developed in the developing world that we need to look at for here. So if the water's out, like Dr. Jones says, she says, who's going to take a bath? If you have a swimming pool, you're lucky, but everybody else, no water for 6 months or whatever, right? So what do they do in other parts of the world where they don't have reliable plumbing systems? What can be done here to bring water for community bathhouses, for example? We're going to have to think out of the box for a catastrophic event. We don't want to lose all of our population. So I'm just throwing those out as a few ideas. Okay, that's it.